Hello everyone, welcome to this second lecture in this series on Western Civ. I hope the mic quality is improved this time around because we're going to be talking about Machiavelli. And in particular, we're going to be discussing Machiavelli's outlook on politics in The Prince. On Canvas, you should have found a series of quotes from The Prince that you can use in studying. And hopefully that is useful. Now, in order to get a sense of who Machiavelli is and what his outlook is, you sort of need to start off with the dedication in The Prince. And in it, he sort of describes what his goal is in the writing of The Prince. He says, "I have found nothing among my possessions I would value more than an understanding of the deeds of great men, acquired through a lengthy experience of contemporary politics, through an uninterrupted study of the classics, since I have long throughout and studied what makes for greatness, and I have now summarized my conclusions on the subject in a little book, which now I send to your magnificence." In The Prince, think of The Prince as history's most over-the-top job application. He is currently looking at the time to re-enter Florence as a civil servant, and such he writes The Prince as an explainer of politics as it is in Renaissance Italy. We're going to look a little bit about the historical background, and this represents really his application for Lorenzo de' Medici, who is now the newly elected ruler of Florence, and he's really looking to get into Florence as an advisor and as a civil servant. But before we look into the history, I wanted to ask a simple question, and that's really going to be the heart of this when we talk about what qualities a ruler should have. We talk about Machiavellian as an adjective, but that's not really a good thing, right? When you call someone a Machiavellian or something Machiavellian, you're not giving that person a compliment, right? These are certain adjectives that might go into that definition: efficient, cunning, discreet, ambitious, masterful. Not necessarily good qualities, but it turns out, and I recognize that the slide has not aged well, these might make for good qualities in a good leader, in a good president. Not necessarily synonymous with them being good people, but maybe the sort of quality you might want in your ruler. And understanding this is going to be crucial to understanding Machiavelli's point. Now, let's understand the life and times of Machiavelli. He lives through Renaissance Italy, and Renaissance Italy represents a bit of a heyday for the kind of politics that Machiavelli espouses. It's when you start thinking again after the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages about politics in a more concrete way again. But the event that really defines Machiavelli's life is Savonarola and the Bonfire of the Vanities. See, in Machiavelli's early life, a young priest named Savonarola, who is inflamed by religious fervor, takes control of the city and begins to burn anything that is considered to be a vanity, anything that exists to make humans feel vain. So anything from art to things like combs and mirrors. And it's a period of great upheaval in society. And of course, eventually the city is freed. The Pope intervenes, but Machiavelli is able to use this opportunity to enter politics as a civil servant in a new republic in Florence. However, when the Medici family seizes control, Machiavelli is exiled from the city as having supported an upstart republic. And as his punishment, he is given a farm and a tract of land in view of his city, but he could never enter it. And so he would wake up every morning and view the city that he loved so much and never enter it. It was a cruel sort of punishment. And at this farm, Machiavelli writes both The Prince and his other book that we're not going to be looking at, The Discourses on Livy. And he starts outlining both a political view, but also a way for him to re-enter the city of Florence. But from the events that surround Savonarola, Machiavelli draws an important point. All armed prophets are victorious, and the disarmed ones are crushed. See, this is what happens in our own day to Friar Savonarola. Without the force to back your words will be crushed. In these events, his exile and what happens to Savonarola really begin to inform his view. Now, in order to understand Machiavelli, there's really three things you need to understand. The economy of violence, which has two stories within it, fear versus love, and virtù. Now, let's look at the first one. Let's look at the economy of violence. In The Prince, the story of Cesare Borgia is used a lot as a frame of reference in understanding what good rulership is. Machiavelli considers Borgia to be a bit of a model for what politics should look like. And he says, quite simply, that Cesare Borgia was thought of as cruel. But the supposed cruelty of his restored order to the Romagna. The Romagna is a region of Italy just north of Florence, united it and rendered it peaceful and law-abiding. If you think about it, you will realize that he was, in fact, much more compassionate than the people of Florence, who, in order to avoid being thought cruel, allowed Pistoia, another city, to tear itself apart. The whole community suffers if there are riots, while to maintain order, the ruler only has to execute one or two individuals. You see, what Machiavelli is saying here is, to be Machiavellian, ask yourself what true cruelty is. If there are riots, if there are unrest in the streets, and the community is suffering, what is more humane? To kill the ringleaders so that everyone goes home and the community is saved? Or to do nothing so that people will not think you cruel and allow the community to tear itself apart? Machiavelli is very much in the camp of long-term ethics versus short-term ethics. And in his view, this is what the economy of violence is. It is the use of a well-timed act of violence to prevent further bloodshed. And in cruelty abused versus cruelty well used, here's what he says. He says, well-used cruelty, if one can speak of evil, one may call those atrocities that are committed at a stroke in order to secure one's power and then never repeated. And rather, every effort is made to ensure one's subjects' benefit in the long run. An abuse of cruelty, one may call those policies that, even if in the beginning they involve little bloodshed, lead to more rather than less as time goes by. You see, what he's saying is, a well-used act of cruelty is one that you only have to do once and then never have to do again. In fact, you can then spend the rest of your days making sure that your subjects are benefiting in the long run. And not, as Machiavelli would say, an abuse of cruelty, which is one that may save bloodshed in the beginning, but lead to more and more as time goes by. It's better to have an act of unspeakable atrocity happen at once and then never repeated, than little by little, death by 1,000 cuts, destroy a community over the long term. In fact, he says, those who use cruelty well may find both God and their subjects are prepared to let bygones be bygones, but those who abuse it cannot hope to retain power indefinitely. He says that memories are short. People will eventually forgive you, especially if the benefits to the community that happen in the aftermath are worth it. Now, the other story Machiavelli tells about the economy of violence is the story of Ramiro d'Orco, and from the title you may guess where this is going. Immediately after the previous story, Machiavelli continues. Once Cesare Borgia had subdued the Romagna, he found it under the control of weak nobles who had exploited rather than governed their subjects, and had been the source of conflict rather than of order. So he decided it was necessary, if he was going to make the province peaceful and obedient to his commands, to give it good government. Now read between the lines. What do you think good government means if you're Machiavelli? Well, I think you've understood already what's about to happen. Accordingly, he set over it Messer Ramiro d'Orco, a stern and prompt ruler, who, being entrusted with the fullest of powers, in a very short time, with much credit to himself, restored it to tranquility and order. Now understand what he is saying. The fullest of powers, tranquility and order. What he has done is that he has installed a strong man, Messer Ramiro d'Orco. And Ramiro d'Orco's job is to act as a tyrant in order to scare people into obedience. But of course the story is not done. Because afterwards, upon learning that such unlimited authority might become odious, the Duke decided that it was no longer needed. And so one morning, he caused Ramiro to be beheaded and exposed in the marketplace of Cesena, with a block and a bloody axe by his side. The barbarity of the spectacle at once astounded and satisfied the populace. See, the moral of the story here is, number one, don't work for Cesare Borgia ever. But the second one is Borgia was able to provide stability, in Machiavelli's view, to the Romagna by using Ramiro himself as an act of well-used cruelty personified. Because in Machiavelli's view, Borgia could have gone in and been amicable and let the resentments of Romagna continue to fester and kill more people over the long term until eventually the whole province was back in chaos. Or, using Ramiro d'Orco, he could provide unspeakable acts of violence and authority to provide stability to the Romagna. But once it was pacified, once it was no longer needed, Ramiro is killed, and Borgia now has control over what Machiavelli would call a pacified province. And so you have to ask yourself, at the end of the day, is it worth it to have cruelty well used? This is the central question at Machiavelli. Now, the second issue that we wanted to talk about is the idea of fear versus love. And he says in chapter 17, here comes the question whether it is better to be loved rather than feared, or feared rather than loved. It might perhaps be answered that you would wish to be both. After all, who wouldn't want to be both feared and loved? But since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it's far safer to be feared than loved. What he's saying is, essentially, every ruler wants to be both loved but also respected and feared. But that's not an option. You don't have both. It's very rare to get both at the same time. And so if you have to choose, it's always better to be feared and respected than loved and not respected. It's safer for you as a ruler to be feared than loved. Nevertheless, he says, he warns, a prince should inspire fear in such a fashion that he does not win love, but he may escape hate. For a man may well be feared, yet not hated. And this will be the case so long as he does not meddle with the property or with the women of his citizens and subjects. Above all, he must abstain from the property of others, for men will soon forget the death of their father over the loss of their patrimony. What he's saying is, understand that there is a limit. You should inspire fear, because you may not necessarily want to win love, but you definitely don't want to be hated. Because it's possible for you to be feared, but also not hated. And you will not be hated if you don't meddle with the things of your citizens. You will find, as a ruler, as an advice that he's giving to Lorenzo de' Medici, that people will forget the death of their parent, but they will not forget the loss of their stuff, of their property. And so what he's arguing is essentially that in that middle ground between love and fear, there is a spectrum of respect. And you always want to err on the safer side of fear to find respect, because it is much safer to be feared than it is to be loved. Now, the last thing I wanted to point out was the idea of virtù. Now, virtue is one of the stranger concepts in Machiavelli. And in it, Machiavelli describes something that we touched upon in the beginning of this lecture, which is, he says that for many authors who have constructed imaginary republics and principalities that have never existed in practice and never could, for the gap between how people actually behave and how they ought to behave is so great that anyone who ignores everyday reality in order to live up to an ideal will soon discover he has taught how to destroy himself, not how to preserve himself. Pulling a lot on Aristotle, Machiavelli agrees that you need to sort of observe the world as it is. But unlike Aristotle, Machiavelli says not only are people not perfect, it turns out that the way people ought to behave and the way people actually behave is very different. And so as a ruler, you need to base yourself on the way your subjects actually behave themselves, as opposed to the way they should behave. And so for anyone who wants to act the part of a good man in all circumstances will bring about his ruin. For those he has to deal with will not all be good. And so it is necessary for a ruler, if he wants to hold on to power, to learn how not to be good, and to know when it is or when it is not necessary to use this knowledge. See, what he's saying is, if people are not good, and you are the ruler of men, not angels, you as a ruler should also understand that political virtue is not always the same as personal virtue. Therefore, it is unnecessary for a prince to have all the good qualities that I've talked about, but it is very necessary to appear to have them. And to have them and to always observe them is injurious, may hurt you. But to appear to have them, to appear merciful and faithful and humane and religious and upright, and to be so, but with a mind framed so that should you require not to be so, you are able and know how to change to the opposite. If men were entirely good, this precept would not hold. This advice would not be useful. But because they are bad, and because they will not keep faith with you, you too are not bound to observe it with them. See, everyone says that they want their ruler to be merciful and faithful and humane and religious and upright and all of these things. But people are not like that, Machiavelli argues. Machiavelli argues people can be bad. And you as a ruler need to prepare yourself for the eventuality that you will also have to be bad in return. Because in a world where there are no angels, or there are no perfectly good people, if you try to behave that way and seek political office, you will be crushed. He continues, that it would be good to be thought generous, but if you act in a way that will get you a reputation for generosity, you'll do yourself damage. If you want to have a reputation for generosity, you must throw yourself into lavish and ostentatious expenditure. Consequently, a ruler who pursues a reputation for generosity will always end up wasting his resources, and he will be obliged in the end, if he wants to preserve his reputation, to impose crushing taxes on the people and be preoccupied with maximizing his resources. This will begin to make him hateful to his subjects. So a ruler should not care about being thought miserly, for it means he will be able to avoid robbing his subjects. What he's saying here is every ruler wants to be considered generous. But think about what you actually have to do to be considered generous. You have to spend lots and lots of money, and you have to increasingly spend lots and lots of money. You always have to one-up yourself in order for people to say, wow, he's generous, all right. Which means not only necessarily throwing fancy parties, it means anyone who comes and asks you for money, you must oblige them and give them that money. But the problem is, as a ruler, the money that you're giving out is not yours. It is the people's money. It is raised with taxes. And so, in order to keep up that reputation, inevitably you're going to have to raise increasingly higher taxes. And that's going to make people hate you, not love you, no matter how generous you are. And so, as a ruler, you should not care about being thought cheap, because the alternative is stealing from your citizens in the form of taxes. You have to be astute enough to avoid being thought to have those evil qualities that will make it impossible for you to retain power. As for those evil qualities that are compatible with holding on to power, you should avoid them if you can. But if you cannot, then you should not worry too much if people say you have them. Honestly, in Machiavelli's view, he says, you should not appear to be, let's say, someone who tortures people for information. However, if people find out that that's what you've been doing, don't worry about them. And above all, do not be upset. If you are supposed to have those vices, a ruler needs if he is going to stay in power. For if you think about it, you will realize that there are some ways of behaving that are supposed to be virtuous, but would lead to your downfall, and others that are supposed to be wicked, but will lead to your welfare and peace of mind. Understanding that if people think that if they waste your time, or if they steal from you, that you're going to execute them, that you're going to kill them and torture them first because you are a cruel person. In reality, that will lead to your welfare and peace of mind. The less time you have to worry about dealing with those that would do wrong by you, the more time you will have to do right by your citizens. You don't have to be wicked, you just have to appear wicked, because that will lead to your political welfare. And so, to summarize virtù, because this is what we mean when we talk about this nebulous quality that Machiavelli is talking about, what he's saying is that political virtue, or virtù as you will find it in tests or on the concept IDs for this module, is not the same as traditional virtue. Because if you behave in the way people have traditionally understood to be virtuous, you will be destroyed. Traditional virtue will also keep you from what needs to be done. What virtù might call for isn't always ethical. It's not always the right thing to do in the moment. But it keeps stability, and in the long term, it's more humane. If you find someone in the treasury stealing money from your citizens, and you commit an unspeakable act of cruelty, that may not be the most ethical thing to do. But virtù would say, you should make an example of that person, because in the long run, it's more humane for your citizens to not have people stealing from the treasury. And so, the big part of virtù that you need to understand is the understanding that you need some vices and some negative qualities to be an effective ruler. And so at the beginning, all of those qualities that we looked at as being Machiavellian, well, maybe you need some of those in order to be effective in what you do. I think the reason why Machiavelli is often frowned upon is not the fear that Machiavelli is wrong. I think the fear is that Machiavelli, on many levels, is right. That this cynical view of politics is correct. Which is why I think Machiavelli gets a bit of a bad rap. But in looking at the context and the time at which he is writing this, it does not appear to me, at least, to be overly controversial. Now, I look forward to discussing this with you. And if you have questions on Machiavelli, please, feel free to contact me, send me a message, and I'd be very happy to discuss it with you. I think we can call that a day. Our next class, we're going to talk about Hobbes, and I look forward to seeing you for that one. Have a very nice day. Bye-bye.